I just couldn't swallow it because it implied that I split. And I don't feel myself split. So he added a footnote to his paper in which he said, that is like the anti-Copernicans in the time of Galileo, who didn't feel the Earth move. The point is that the theory in both cases tells you precisely that you will not feel it. In the case of quantum mechanics, you will not feel yourself split. In the case of classical mechanics, you will not feel the Earth move.
Alright, so last week I did the video called Quantum Fairy Tale, playing a clip from David Harriman speaking from his lecture series on the philosophical corruption of physics. And since then I've been wanting to come back and talk more about this whole idea of philosophical assumptions that preempt or subvert science, because that is essentially his assertion when he's talking about quantum physics. But like I said, he's at the same time totally affirming what he calls classical physics, Newtonian physics. And so, of course, from the flat Earth perspective, we're looking at both of those arenas as basically being pseudosciences that are predicated upon faulty philosophical assumptions. You know, the heliocentric model obviously stemming from the Copernican principle. And actually, for anyone who doesn't know, I did do a video long while back now, almost 2 years, I suppose, called The Copernican Principle, Darwin's Trojan Horse. And I hadn't watched it in a long time, but I think it really has held up, actually. It's one of my few earlier videos that I still think holds its own. And so I'm going to tie that into some of this discussion, as well as a few different things I've talked about in different videos, because they all kind of tie back in. But holding these two philosophical shifts side by side is really interesting. At least it is to me, so hopefully you think so as well. Now, when it comes to the philosophical shift that preempted the introduction of quantum physics and the interpretation of quantum physics, it can get tricky because it's not a monolithic field, obviously. And so when you're trying to kind of make blanket statements about quantum physics or make a critique of it as a whole, sometimes what we start to get back is the objection that not everyone is adhering to the same interpretations of quantum physics. And so, for instance, someone was recently telling me about some dialogue they were having with Danny Faulkner, who's the creation astronomer, and was trying to point out some of the things that I talk about regarding quantum physics and things like in my ethereal documentary. And Faulkner's response was that, that all the nonsense having to do with quantum physics is essentially all because of the faulty Copenhagen interpretation. And it's true that a lot of the stuff that we hear when it comes to, all the PBS specials and things like Neil deGrasse Tyson and Michio Kaku and a lot of the big names, when they're talking about quantum physics and how weird it is, Richard Feynman and these kind of guys, they are kind of coming out of this Copenhagen interpretation, this school of thought. But okay, the question remains, is there some other interpretation of quantum physics that really pulls it all the way back to something akin to the supposedly hallowed ground of classical Newtonian physics, which seems to be sort of the attitude and the argument being made? But when you really start looking into it and listening to what are some of these other alternative interpretations of quantum mechanics and things like the double slit experiment, even when you're going to the people that are saying that they reject this Copenhagen interpretation, at the end of the day, you still find, sort of a philosophical takeaway that nevertheless still boils down to this quantum mysticism type of conclusions. One of them is David Bohm, and this guy is talking about, this was a colleague of David Bohm, sort of boiling down his work. David Bohm was a physicist who rejected certain ideas from the Copenhagen interpretation.
Now, if we go back to the theory, we have the double slit experiment. Now, according to the Copenhagen, sometimes it's a wave, sometimes it's a particle, and, well, we don't know what it is, but who wants to know anyway? It's not our job to go into that. Is that what Copenhagen is saying?
Yes, it's saying, and not only that it's not our job, we can't do it.
We can't do it.
There's some epistemological principle that prevents us from doing it.
Yes. But David is saying, no, there is a particle which remains a particle, but how does he...
he would say not that there's a particle, that there is some structure there. You see, what he wanted to say was, I don't want to think of the whole world in terms of particles interacting with each other or fields interacting with each other. Because when you go to relativity, you can't sustain a little billiard ball. It can't be solid because you can do your Lorentz transformation and it goes flat. So what you've got to do is you've got to change your view. You've got to go to a process view. Everything is process. Even we are processes because we eat, we breathe out, we sweat, we defecate. So we're really a process going on, and there's something that remains invariant. And that's the particle, if you like. But it's not the solid billiard ball that people would like. So the electron, when he's going through the slits, is not just an isolated point, but it's what I call a quantum blob. That it has a center of activity, but it also has a wider feature, which is this quantum potential. But it means looking at nature in a very different way. Because what we do with Copenhagen is to say, well, we'll keep all the classical concepts. We'll keep the classical concept of a particle. We'll keep the classical concept of a wave. And then we'll say, well, we can't put them together into one structure, but we'll say they're complementary. And then we'll talk about complementary descriptions, and it's confused. If you look at, trust me, Tahir, if you look at what they say about wave-particle duality, you think you don't understand it because you're not clever enough. You don't understand it because it's not understandable. That's the difference. And Dave and I think we found something which will enable us to unite those two features in a way which is understandable. And that means bringing in new concepts like process, where we are essentially processes which keep reproducing ourselves. They're called idempotence in the mathematics. And particles are like that. They're not something solid. They're a process which keeps repeating itself so that it stays more or less the same. In the case of particles, always the same. In the case of us, we always change a little bit, you know, as we get new ideas and so on. But we are a process, and whereas much our existence has much to do with the environment, not only the physical environment we live in, but also the mental environment we live in. We create our own realities. And what you're telling me about different sections of the family, they create one reality, you create another reality, and then you're fighting each other because you maybe not you, but you get these two realities and they're really hammering at each other. Whereas if they only step back and to see that it's both part of the same overall process.
So what we're saying is physics is biology at a smaller scale.
Yes, there's no difference between physics and biology, fundamentally. You've got it. And then you can even be outrageous and say, well, maybe even the electron has a proto-consciousness. There's a thought.
And then this is Ron Garrett. He gave a Google Tech Talk back in, I believe it was like 2009. And he was a guy who worked at Google and JPL and a number of different places like this. And he's also articulating what he has essentially come up with is another alternative interpretation, in contrast to the Copenhagen interpretation. And yet, at the end of his presentation, this is the kind of thing he's saying as well.
So this has some philosophical implications. I called it the zero universe interpretation of quantum mechanics. If you buy this as a description of what the physics of the universe is really like, then it tells you unambiguously that it is not the case that the reason that measurements are consistent across space and time is because there's a real underlying metaphysical reality out there. It tells you, in fact, the exact opposite, that what we really are is, as David Merman puts it, correlations without correlata. We are not made of atoms. We are actually made of bits. We are our thoughts. And these thoughts actually reside, if you will forgive stretching a metaphor to the breaking point, we are a simulation running on a quantum computer. Here is an explanation in terms of physical theory of why the universe is comprehensible. Quantum mechanics actually predicts a comprehensible universe, but at the cost of forcing you to believe that what you perceive as physical reality is not actually real. It's actually an illusion.
So, okay, I just wanted to kind of show these sorts of different examples here to kind of make the broader underlying point that regardless of whether you're strictly adhering to this Copenhagen interpretation or veering off into some sort of alternative interpretation, what we still inevitably come away with is some form of this sort of quantum weirdness, this quantum, what I would call quantum mysticism. But essentially what it always kind of boils down to is some way of articulating the idea that on the quantum level, things, the physics of things operate in ways that would seem counterintuitive and rather opposed to our classical sense of physical sciences and physical mechanics. That the deeper into the quantum realm you go, the weirder and more counterintuitive it becomes. And so really, this is what is so interesting to me, is because when you kind of hold this up side by side with the Copernican principle, whereby the Copernican principle assumed that the entire universe is homogeneous and isotropic, and when you really understand what the original, specifically coming from a Christian point of view here, as I do, if you understand what the original biblical cosmology was, where the heavens were, there was a clear distinction between the earth and the heavens, and there was no assumption that the stars and the luminaries and the things seen up in the sky, those lights in the sky, that they were physical objects that could be analyzed and broken down and put into equations the same way that, you could calculate your trajectory of a catapult or something like that, which is what Newtonian physics does. Essentially takes all these observations of the stars and their rotations and their motions, and then just uses math and assumption and breaks it all down as though these are all physical phenomena, no different than anything that we could see and touch and experiment with in a lab, even though you can't do that with the heavens. So it's all theoretical and abstract. But essentially what it does is turn everything, it's a departure from the original cosmology where there is a distinction between the physical and the spiritual, or the ethereal, if you will. And so it just wipes that away and basically assumes that anything that was originally part of the spiritual realm is then physical. So it's materialism. It's the introduction of scientific materialism. That's really what the Copernican principle is all about. So for several centuries then you have this, as the implications of Copernican cosmology sort of permeate the scientific, that's where materialism permeates academia and permeates science. And then of course evolution and Darwinism come on the heels of that. So everything becomes material and mechanistic. But then, ironically, at the end of the 1800s and the early 1900s, to me what is so fascinating is how just the rampant materialism, as it just keeps quantifying and quantitizing and making materialistic assumptions about matter and energy and relativity, comes into play. And then it all actually, whether you go with the Copenhagen interpretation or not, it all ends up inevitably sort of eating itself and flipping itself all back around to where, because everything's material, then eventually the conclusion is that everything is effectively immaterial. So it's like the pendulum swings all the way to one extreme, only to then swing back to the other extreme. To where, now we have guys like Jim Carrey talking about how nothing is real, and everyone thinks that he's He's really figured it out. He's really speaking the truth. And, and Russell Brand too. Oh, I really like the idea that, everything's just that all of reality is just a projection into our consciousness. I mean, he's spouting all the same stuff, the same ideas of simulation theory, basically. That's what the quantum mechanics inevitably feeds into. So it's just kind of bizarre when you think this idea that the philosophical assumption of materialism eventually and inevitably morphs into the philosophical assumption of simulation theory, or everything effectively being an illusion. But that's what we see. That's what we see. And so when we are able to just kind of break it down to these it's sort of like two pillars, ironically. It's very Masonic, I guess, to where you have these two sort of opposing things that synthesize into something rather unexpected. Although it shouldn't, but we know what that something is, in terms of it's essentially all coming back full circle to the Mystery Babylon religion. The spirit science religion, this quantum mystic religion. I just think that if we're able to really get a good handle on that and be able to kind of show people this is where I think the more we really understand how this operates, these two philosophical assumptions kind of swinging back and forth and one playing off the other and all pouring into this eventual conclusion. This is what we then take to the Danny Faulkners and the different creation scientists and cosmologists and apologists and pastors and teachers and people who it's always this case of trying to cling to some element of the scientism paradigm while reject others. It's always this kind of wanting your cake and to eat it too. You're always trying to kind of, you're trying to cling to Newton and cling to Copernicus, but then reject, Neil deGrasse Tyson telling us that we're all made of star stuff. And for many decades, creationism has just revolved around trying to deny the millions, billions of years, but affirm everything else. Just denying the extended periods of time, but affirming all the rest of astrophysics as much as possible, and trying to reconcile that with the Bible and having to come up with more and more convoluted explanations and arguments as to how that's even possible. Speaking of Danny Faulkner, I actually stumbled across this video that he made like last year, talking about the firmament, and he goes on and on for a while, but at the end he actually made an astounding statement that I was not even aware that he had taken this position, but apparently somewhere around last year or recently, he's actually come so far. Obviously he's a very outspoken critic of enclosed cosmology, biblical flat earth cosmology, obviously, since he's an astrophysicist just like Jason Lyle. But he's actually come so far to where he now, because of Scripture, what Scripture says, is stating that the waters above the firmament is actually liquid water outside of the entire universe itself.
Number one, if the expanse, this rakia, this firmament, is space, then remember it's separating waters below on the earth, waters above, so there must be waters just beyond where that is. If the waters are just beyond, then there must be an edge to the thing. There must be an end to the universe.
Wow.
And that's something that cosmologists, astronomers, physicists can't even fathom today. And it took me, I saw that, whoa, it's like having a head-on collision. It was jarring, but I'm very comfortable with it now because it seems to come out of the Genesis creation account. Number two, since it expands, the rakia is this thing that's expanded or stretched outward, it coming from the center, and what's at the center? The earth is. So consequently, the universe has a center, and by the way, we're pretty close to it. Again, that's even worse than the universe having an edge, perhaps, because
we're not the center, but we're close to the center.
We might be the center. We might be. I don't have to be exact. It's like horseshoes and hand grenades. Close is good enough.
All right.
But there's some evidence, by the way, dealing with redshifts of galaxies that suggests this is the case. Astronomers ignore it and have for 40 years, but there is evidence to suggest that this actually is the situation. Now think about that. If this vast universe has a center and we happen to be near it, what does that suggest? Suggests there's a creator. We've got some sort of special location.
We have a special relationship with the creator.
And so consequently, most scientists don't like this conclusion at all.
Scientists don't want to go there.
Quite a few.
Yeah.
And then finally, the water is at the edge of this thing. There's water out there.
So I was, like I said, I was really surprised to hear him saying this, because you just see it kind of, on the one hand, I got a little bit excited because it's like you're seeing it chip away. I'm not holding my breath for him to ever go so far as to admit that space is a fabrication and a hoax and all that. Fat chance of that ever happening, in my opinion. But to me, I think for the sake of showing other people, like, again, it's that sort of, you're half in, half out. You're trying to play both sides. You're on the one hand, you're laughing at people who would dare, reject the idea that stars are millions and billions of light years away because of what we know from science and what our telescopes and everything else. But then you're saying, well, the Bible says that there's waters above the firmament, so therefore there must be water outside the universe. And even though all those same astrophysicists would laugh at such a thing. So it's very, you just pick and choose which ones you are willing to believe the Bible and which ones you're going to go with the mainstream narrative. So it's, it's extremely hypocritical in my view. But he's also essentially kind of inching his way closer towards geocentrism. He's not saying that the Earth is the absolute center of the universe, but he's saying it's pretty darn close. And he starts mentioning the microwave background radiation. And basically, I think he's just been influenced by the work done by all those guys in that documentary, The Principle, the geocentric. So apparently Faulkner's kind of starting to lean that way. But again, I think it just only shows like how you're kind of talking out of two sides of your mouth again, unless you just, you can't just go a few steps and then stop. But at the end of the day, you're still talking about the universe having a literal edge, a literal boundary. Like we live inside a huge bubble. It's just you've got a way bigger snow globe. You've got a way bigger enclosed cosmology, but it's enclosed cosmology. And I talked about this months ago in a video I did about Doug Hamp, where he was essentially purporting the same idea in the same defense. But it's really kind of silly when you just boil it down, because they can't argue that one is just ridiculous and laughable, and then the other one is something to be taken seriously, because a finite creation is a finite creation. It's just all you're doing is arguing over the diameter of it, really. And so this whole enclosed cosmology with the whole universe inside of it is you're trying to kind of placate the Copernican cosmologist and still look respectable in the eyes of science. That's what so much of this nonsense is all about. You still want to preserve a degree of respectability with the mainstream science, but also try and adhere to what the Bible says, and you're trying to play both sides, and you just can't do it. And I'll just close with this. One of the things that really solidified a lot of things for me was when I started looking into this term Oranos, which is for heaven, and how it is used in the New Testament, and even when we look at Jesus. And so many instances in the Gospels where when Jesus stops to pray and he actually looks towards heaven, this word, Oranos, and prays to his Father. And every time where it says he looks up, it's looking up at the sky. If you're trying to say that the Bible doesn't teach that we live on a flat stationary earth, then it honestly makes no sense why Jesus would have been actually pausing to look up at the sky, as if he didn't know that space was in every direction, and that the Earth was constantly turning, and that the whole solar system was constantly revolving and moving and spinning through space, and that so the whole idea of up is meaningless. The whole idea of why would you look out into this particular point in space one day and that particular point in space another day to pray to your Father? Was that just for the sake of the ignorant goat herder Hebrews that he was talking to? Was he just sort of humoring them by looking up at the sky and praying to his Father? But no, you have this word Uranos that means the physical sky that you can look up at, and it also is talking about the spiritual realm, the spiritual heaven, a higher spiritual dimension, simultaneously. So right there, your cosmology is challenged when you're trying to hold to a Copernican viewpoint, just by Jesus praying, because that is the original biblical cosmology. And the more you look at it, the more you will see this to be true. And so the Copernican principle was absolutely there was absolutely good reason for so many theologians and people within Christianity to push back against the Copernican principle, because they understood what was really at stake. They understood what was going on. But because we don't even know what that we don't appreciate what that original cosmology was, we don't appreciate what they were initially attacking and denying. But then, yeah, now we've come full circle to where now you can only exist in that. It's just like so many other things where you can only exist in the vacuum of nihilistic atheism for so long before the culture starts to swing back around to mysticism and paganism and Luciferianism. So just like that scientific atheism, it's sort of a temporary roundabout, I guess. That's kind of how I see the classical quote-unquote Newtonian physics. And yet so many generations of Christians have elevated it and celebrated it and just built so much of their apologetics on this phony paradigm that they refuse to acknowledge like where it's all designed to take everything. And so this is why quantum physics is something that I'm continuing to try and kind of take apart and show. I mean, when you're hearing Neil deGrasse Tyson, like the video I showed yesterday, where he says this kinship with the universe, it resonates deeply with New Age ideas, and if that's where it takes us, then that's where it takes us, and I have no problem with that. Which is ironic, because it's like he, of course, would have a big problem if it pointed people to the Bible, because he has a huge issue with biblical thinking. He mocks it and just rips on it. So, but if it happens to resonate with New Age thinking, well then, hey, we're just, like he's so unbiased. But I mean, you're seeing where all the belief system that all of these pseudoscientific paradigms continually push people towards, and at some point you have to stop and go like, wow, where did this train start? Where did it really get off track from the Bible? And the Copenhagen interpretation is not far back enough, and we can demonstrate this. We can demonstrate this from Scripture, and we can demonstrate it, I think, historically and empirically. And that's what I think we should continue seeking to do. Thank you so much. assumptions that preempt or subvert science, because that is essentially his assertion when he's talking about quantum physics. But like I said, he's at the same time totally affirming what he calls classical physics, Newtonian physics. And so, of course, from the flat Earth perspective, we're looking at both of those arenas as basically being pseudosciences that are predicated upon faulty philosophical assumptions. You know, the heliocentric model obviously stemming from the Copernican principle. And actually, for anyone who doesn't know, I did do a video long while back now, almost 2 years, I suppose.
I just couldn't swallow it because it implied that I split. And I don't feel myself split. So he added a footnote to his paper in which he said, that is like the anti-Copernicans in the time of Galileo, who didn't feel the Earth move. The point is that the theory in both cases tells you precisely that you will not feel it. In the case of quantum mechanics, you will not feel yourself split. In the case of classical mechanics, you will not feel the Earth move.
It's not a monolithic field, obviously. And so when you're trying to kind of make blanket statements about quantum physics or make a critique of it as a whole, sometimes what we start to get back is the objection that not everyone is adhering to the same interpretations of quantum physics. And so, for instance, someone was recently telling me about some dialogue they were having with Danny Faulkner, who's the creation astronomer, and was trying to point out some of the things that I talk about regarding quantum physics and things like in my ethereal documentary. And Faulkner's response was that, that all the nonsense having to do with quantum physics, called the Copernican principle Darwin's Trojan horse. And I hadn't watched it in a long time, but I think it really has held up, actually. It's one of my few earlier videos that I still think holds its own. And so I'm going to tie that into some of this discussion, as well as a few different things I've talked about in different videos, because they all kind of tie back in. But holding these two philosophical shifts side by side is really interesting. At least it is to me, so hopefully you think so as well. Now, when it comes to the philosophical shift that preempted the introduction of quantum physics and the interpretation of quantum physics, it can get tricky because there's Alright, so last week I did the video called Quantum Fairy Tale, playing a clip from David Harriman speaking from his lecture series on the philosophical corruption of physics. And since then I've been wanting to come back and talk more about this whole idea of philosophical assumptions